This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 21, In Europe. I was going back to Europe after more than 13 years, years of war and revolution and tremendous change. The old world I knew had expired in the blood and horror of the war, and a new world awaited me. I expected to remain in Europe for 6 or 7 months, or at most till the end of the year. Actually, our stay lengthened out to a year and 9 months. It was a quiet and restful period for both my mind and body. We spent it chiefly in Switzerland, in Geneva, and in a mountain sanatorium at Montana. My younger sister, Krishna, came from India and joined us early in the summer of 1926, and remained with us till the end of our stay in Europe. I could not leave my wife for long, and so I could only pay brief visits to other places. Later, when my wife was better, we travelled a little in France, England, and Germany. On our mountain top, surrounded by the winter snow, I felt completely cut off from India as well as the European world. India and Indian happenings seemed especially far away. I was a distant onlooker, reading, watching, following events, gazing at the new Europe, its politics, economics, and the far freer human relationships, and trying to understand them. When we were in Geneva, I was naturally interested in the activities of the League of Nations and the International Labour Office. But with the coming of winter, the winter sports absorbed my attention. For some months they were my chief occupation and interest. I had done ice skating previously, but skiing was a new experience, and I succumbed to its fascination. It was a painful experience for a long time, but I persisted bravely, in spite of innumerable falls, and I came to enjoy it. Life was very uneventful on the whole. The days went by, and my wife gradually gained strength and health. We saw few Indians. Indeed, we saw few people apart from the little colony living in that mountain resort. But in the course of the year and 3/4 that we spent in Europe, we came across some Indian exiles and old revolutionaries whose names had been familiar to me. There was Shyamaji Krishnavarma living with his ailing wife high up on the top floor of a house in Geneva. The aged couple lived by themselves with no whole-time servants, and their rooms were musty and suffocating, and everything had a thick layer of dust. Shyamaji had plenty of money, but he did not believe in spending it. He would even save a few centimes by walking instead of taking the tram. He was suspicious of all comers, presuming them, until the contrary was proved, to be either British agents or after his money. His pockets bulged with ancient copies of his old paper, The Indian Sociologist, and he would pull them out and point with some excitement to some article he had written a dozen years previously. His talk was of the old days, of India House at Hampstead, of the various persons that the British government had sent to spy on him, and how he had spotted them and outwitted them. The walls of his rooms were covered with shelves full of old books, dust-laden and neglected, looking down sorrowfully on the intruder. Books and papers also littered the floor. They seemed to have remained so for days and weeks, and even months past. Over the whole place there hung an atmosphere of gloom, an air of decay. Life seemed to be an unwelcome stranger there, and as one walked through the dark and silent corridors, one almost expected to come across, round the corner, the shadow of death. With relief one came out of that flat and breathed the air outside. Shyamaji desired to make some arrangement about his money, to create some trust for a public purpose, preferably for the education of Indians in foreign countries. He suggested that I might be one of the trustees, but I showed no keenness for shouldering this responsibility. I had no desire to get mixed up with his financial affairs, and besides, I felt that if I showed any undue interest, he would immediately suspect me of coveting his money. No one knew how much he had. It was rumoured that he had lost greatly in the German inflation. Occasionally prominent Indians used to pass through Geneva. Those who came to the League of Nations were of the official variety, and Shyamaji would not of course go anywhere near them. But the Labour Office sometimes brought non-officials of note, even prominent congressmen, and Shyamaji would try to meet them. It was interesting to watch their reactions to him. Invariably, they felt uncomfortable and tried to avoid him in public and excused themselves whenever they could in private. He was not considered a safe person with whom to be associated or seen with, and so Shamaji and his wife lived their lonely life without children or relatives or friends, with hardly any associations, hardly any human contacts. He was a relic of the past and had really outlived his day. He did not fit in with the present, and the world passed him by, ignoring him. But there was still some of the old fire in his eyes, and though there was little in common between him and me, I could not withhold my sympathy and consideration for him. Recently, the newspapers reported his death, followed soon after by the death of the gentle Gujarati old lady who had been his lifelong companion in exile in foreign lands. It was stated that a large sum of money was left by her for the training of Indian women abroad. Another well-known person whose name I had often heard, but whom I met for the first time in Switzerland,
was Raja Mahendra Pratap.
He was, and I suppose is still, a delightful optimist, living completely in the air and refusing to have anything to do with realities. I was a little taken aback when I first saw him. He appeared in strange composite attire, which might have been suitable in the highlands of Tibet or in the Siberian plains, but was completely out of place at Montreux in the summer. It was a kind of semi-military costume, with high Russian boots, and there were numerous large pockets, all bulging with papers, photographs, etc. There was a letter from Bethmann Hollweg, the German Chancellor, an autographed picture of the Kaiser, a fine scroll from the Dalai Lama of Tibet, and innumerable documents and pictures. It was amazing how much those various pockets contained. He told us that once he had lost a dispatch box containing valuable papers in China, and ever since then he had considered it safer to carry his papers on his person, hence the numerous pockets.
Mahendra Pratap
Was full of stories of his wanderings and adventures in Japan, China, Tibet, and Afghanistan. He had led a varied life, and the record of it was an interesting one. His latest enthusiasm was for a happiness society which he had himself founded, and which had for its motto, "Be happy." Apparently, this society had met with the greatest success in Latvia, or was it Lithuania? His idea of propaganda was to send out periodically large numbers of postcards containing a printed message from him to members of various conferences that met in Geneva or elsewhere. These messages were signed by him, but the name given was an extraordinary one, long and varied.
Mahendra Pratap
Had been reduced to initials, but many other names had been added, each addition representing apparently some favored country he had visited. In this way he emphasized his international and cosmopolitan character, and fittingly the final description below this unique name was servant of mankind. It was difficult to take
Mahendra Pratap
seriously. He seemed to be a character out of medieval romance, a Don Quixote who had strayed into the 20th century, but he was absolutely straight and thoroughly earnest. In Paris we saw old Madame Cama, rather fierce and terrifying as she came up to you and peered into your face, and pointing at you, asked abruptly who you were. The answer made no difference, probably she was too deaf to hear it, for she formed her own impressions and stuck to them, despite facts to the contrary. Then there was Maulvi Obeidullah, whom I met for a short while in Italy. He seemed to me to be clever, but rather in the sense of possessing an ability for old-style political maneuvering. He was not in touch with modern ideas. He had produced a scheme for the United States or United Republics of India, which was quite an able attempt to solve the communal problem. He told me of some of his past activities in Istanbul. It was still called Constantinople then, and not attaching much importance to them, I soon forgot about them. Some months later, he met Lala Lajpat Rai and apparently repeated the same story to him. Lalaji was vastly impressed and exercised about it, and that story, with many unjustifiable inferences and amazing deductions, played an important part in the Indian Council elections that year. Maulvi Obeidullah later went to the Hejaz, and for years past no news of him has come my way. Another Maulvi, but a different type entirely,
was Barkatullah,
whom I first met in Berlin. He was a delightful old man, very enthusiastic and very likable. He was rather simple, not very intelligent, but still trying to imbibe new ideas and to understand the present-day world. He died in San Francisco in 1927 while we were in Switzerland. I was grieved to learn of his passing away. In Berlin, there was quite a number of those who had formed an Indian group in wartime, but the group had long gone to pieces. They had fallen out and quarreled amongst themselves, each suspecting the other of betrayal. That seems to be the fate of political exiles everywhere. Many of these Berlin Indians had settled down to sedate middle-class occupations, when these could be had, and that was not often in post-war Germany, and had ceased to be in any way revolutionary. They even avoided politics. The story of this old wartime group was interesting. Most of them were students in various German universities in that fateful summer of 1914. They lived a common life with the German students, sang their songs, joined in their games, drank beer with them, and approached their culture with sympathy and consideration. The war was no concern of theirs, but they could not help being moved to some extent by the wave of nationalistic hysteria that swept over Germany. Their feeling was really anti-British and not pro-German, and their Indian nationalism inclined them to the enemies of Britain. Soon after the outbreak of the war, a few other Indians, more consciously revolutionary, drifted into Germany through Switzerland. These people formed themselves into a committee and sent for Hardéal, who was on the west coast of the United States at the time. Hardéal came some months later, but meanwhile the committee had become quite important. This importance had been thrust upon them by the German government, who were, naturally, anxious to exploit all anti-British feelings to their own advantage. The Indians, on their part, wanted to take advantage of the international situation for their own nationalistic purposes, and had no intention of allowing themselves to be exploited purely for Germany's advantage. They did not have much choice in the matter, but they felt that they had something to give which the German authorities were keen on having, and this gave them a handle to bargain with. They insisted on assurances and pledges for Indian freedom. The German Foreign Office seems to have entered into a regular treaty with them, in which it pledged itself to acknowledge Indian independence in case of victory, and it was on this pledge and condition, and many other minor conditions, that the Indian group promised support in the war. The committee was officially honored in every way, and its representatives were treated almost on the footing of foreign ambassadors. This sudden importance, thrust on a small group consisting mainly of inexperienced young men, went to the heads of some of them. They felt that they were playing a historic role, that they were involved in great and epoch-making undertakings. Many of them had exciting adventures, hair-breadth escapes. In the later stages of the war, their importance visibly lessened, and they began to be ignored. Hardéal, who had come over from America, had long been discarded. He did not fit in with the committee at all, and both the committee and the German government considered him unreliable and quietly pushed him aside. Years later, when I was in Europe in 1936 and 1937, I was surprised to find with what bitterness and resentment most of the old Indian residents in Europe thought of Hardéal. He lived at the time in Sweden. I did not meet him. The war ended, and with it ended finally the Indian Committee in Berlin. Life became a dreary affair for them after the failure of all their hopes. They had gambled for high stakes and lost. In any event, life would have seemed a humdrum affair after the high adventure and importance of those wartime years. But even a secure, humdrum life was not to be had for the asking. They could not return to India, and defeated Germany after the war was not an easy place to live in. It was a hard struggle. A few of them were later allowed by the British government to return to India, but many had to stay on in Germany. Their position was peculiar. They were apparently citizens of no state. They had no proper passports. Travel outside Germany was hardly possible. Even residence in Germany was full of difficulties and was at the mercy of the local police. It was a life of insecurity and hardship, and day-to-day worry, of continual anxiety to find the wherewithal to eat and live. The Nazi regime since early in 1933 has added to their misfortunes unless they fall in completely with the Nazi doctrine. Non-Nordic and especially Asiatic foreigners are not welcome in Germany. They are only suffered to exist so long as they behave. Hitler has pointedly declared himself in favor of British imperialist rule in India, no doubt because he wants to gain the goodwill of Britain, and he does not wish to encourage any Indians who may have displeased the British government. One of the exiles in Berlin whom we met, a prominent member of the old wartime group, was Champak Raman Pillai. He was rather pompous, and young Indian students had given him an irreverent title. He could think in terms of nationalism only, and shrunk away from the social or economic approach to a question. With the German nationalists, the steel helmets, he was perfectly at home. He was one of the very few Indians in Germany who got on with the Nazis. A few months back in jail, I read of his death in Berlin. An entirely different type of person was
Virendranath Chattopadhyay,
member of a famous family in India. Popularly known as Chatto, he was a very able and a very delightful person. He was always hard up, his clothes were very much the worse for wear, and often he found it difficult to raise the wherewithal for a meal. But his humour and light-heartedness never left him. He had been some years senior to me during my educational days in England. He was at Oxford when I went to Harrow. Since those days he had not returned to India, and sometimes a fit of homesickness came to him when he longed to be back. All his home ties had long been severed, and it is quite certain that if he came to India he would soon feel unhappy and out of joint. But in spite of the passage of many years and long wandering, the pool of the home remains. No exile can escape the malady of his tribe, that consumption of the soul, as Mazzini called it. I must say that I was not greatly impressed by most of the Indian political exiles that I met abroad, although I admired their sacrifice and sympathized with their sufferings and present difficulties, which are very real. I did not meet many of them. There are so many spread out all over the world. Only a few are known to us even by reputation, and the others have dropped out of the Indian world and been forgotten by their countrymen whom they sought to serve. Of the few I met, the only persons who impressed me intellectually were V. Chattopadhyay and M.N. Roy. Roy I met for a brief half-hour in Moscow. He was a leading communist then, although subsequently his communism drifted away from the orthodox Comintern brand. Chatto was not, I believe, a regular communist, but he was communistically inclined. Roy has been in an Indian prison for more than 3 years now. There were many other Indians floating about the face of Europe, talking a revolutionary language, making daring and fantastic suggestions, asking curious questions. They seemed to have the impress of the British Secret Service upon them. We met, of course, many Europeans and Americans. From Geneva we went on a pilgrimage many a time, the first time with a letter of introduction from Gandhiji to the Villa Olga at Villeneuve to see Romain Rolland. Another precious memory is that of Ernst Toller, the young German poet and dramatist, now under Nazi rule, no longer a German, and of Roger Baldwin, of the Civil Liberties Union of New York. In Geneva we also made friends with
Dhan Gopal Mukherjee,
the author, who has settled down in America. Before going to Europe I had met Frank Buchmann of the Oxford Group movement in India. He had given me some of the literature of his movement, and I had read it with amazement. Sudden conversions and confessions, and a revivalist atmosphere generally, seemed to me to go ill with intellectuality. I could not make out how some persons, who seemed obviously intelligent, should experience these strange emotions and be affected by them to a great extent. I grew curious. I met Frank Buchmann again in Geneva, and he invited me to one of his international house parties somewhere in Romania. I think this one was. I was sorry I could not go and look at this new emotionalism at close quarters. My curiosity has thus remained unsatisfied, and the more I read about the growth of the Oxford Group movement, the more I wonder. End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22. Controversies in India. Soon after our arrival in Switzerland, the general strike broke out in England. I was vastly excited, and my sympathies were naturally all on the strikers' side. The collapse of the strike, after a few days, came almost as a personal blow. Some months later I happened to visit England for a few days. The miners' struggle was still on, and London lay in semi-darkness at night. I paid a brief visit to a mining area. I think it was somewhere in Derbyshire. I saw the haggard and pinched faces of the men and women and children, and more revealing still, I saw many of the strikers and their wives being tried in the local or county court. The magistrates were themselves directors or managers of the coal mines, and they tried the miners and sentenced them for trivial offences under certain emergency regulations. One case especially angered me. 3 or 4 women with babies in their arms were brought up in the dock for the offence of having jeered at the blacklegs. The young mothers and their babies were obviously miserable and undernourished. The long struggle had told upon them and enfeebled them and embittered them against the scabs who seemed to take the bread from their mouths. One reads often about class justice, and in India nothing is commoner than this, but somehow I had not expected to come across such a flagrant example of it in England. It came as a shock. Another fact that I noticed with some surprise was the general atmosphere of fear among the strikers. They had definitely been terrorized by the police and the authorities, and they put up very meekly, I thought, with rather offensive treatment. It is true that they were thoroughly exhausted after a long struggle, their spirit was near breaking point, their comrades of other trade unions had long deserted them. But still, compared to the poor Indian worker, there was a world of difference. The British miners had still a powerful organization, the sympathy of a nationwide and indeed worldwide trade union movement, publicity, and resources of many kinds. All these were lacking to the Indian worker, and yet that frightened and terrorized look in the two had a strange resemblance. In India that year there were the triennial elections to the Legislative Assembly and the provincial councils. I was not interested in them, but some echoes of fierce controversies managed to reach me in Switzerland. I learnt of a new party having been formed by
Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya
and Lala Lajpat Rai to oppose the Swaraj Party or the regular Congress Party in the legislature, as it now was. The Nationalist Party, this was called. I could not make out, and I still do not know, what grounds of principle separated the new party from the old. Indeed, most present-day Indian parties in the legislature are like Tweedledum and Tweedledee. No real principles separate them. The Swaraj Party for the first time brought a new and aggressive element in the councils, and it stood for a more extreme political policy than the others. But the difference was one of degree, not of kind. The new Nationalist Party represented a more moderate outlook and was definitely more to the right than was the Swaraj Party. It was also wholly a Hindu party working in close cooperation with the Hindu Mahasabha. Pandit Malviya's leadership of it was easy to understand, for it represented as nearly as possible his own public attitude. He had, because of old associations, continued to remain in the Congress, but his intellectual outlook was not dissimilar to that of the Liberals or moderates. He had not taken kindly to non-cooperation and the new direct action methods of the Congress, and had had no share in shaping Congress policy. Although greatly respected and always welcome to it, he was not really of the new Congress. He was not a member of its small executive, the working committee. He did not carry out the Congress mandates, especially in regard to the legislatures. He was also the most popular leader of the Hindu Mahasabha, and in regard to communal matters, his policy differed from that of the Congress. To Congress he had that sentimental attachment to an organization with which he had been connected almost from the very beginning, partly to an emotional pull in the direction of the freedom struggle, for he saw that the Congress was the only organization doing anything effective about it. His heart was thus often in the Congress camp, especially in times of struggle. His head was in other camps. Inevitably, this led to a continual conflict within him, and occasionally to a simultaneous attempt to march in opposite directions. The result was public confusion, but nationalism is a confusing medley, and Malviya ji was a nationalist alone and not concerned with social or economic change. He was and is a supporter of the old orthodox order culturally, socially, economically. The Indian princes and the talukdars and big zamindars consider him rightly as a benevolent friend. The sole change he desires, and desires passionately, is the complete elimination of foreign control in India. The political training and reading of his youth still influence his mind greatly. and he looks upon this dynamic, revolutionary, post-war world of the 1950s 20th century with the spectacles of a semi-static 19th century, of T.H. Green and John Stuart Mill and Madstone and Morley, and a 3,000 or 4,000 year background of old Hindu culture and sociology. It is a curious combination, bristling with contradictions, but he has an amazing confidence in his own capacity to resolve contradictions. His long record of public service in various fields from early youth upwards, his success in establishing a great institution like the Benares Hindu University, his manifest sincerity and earnestness, his impressive oratory, and his gentle nature and winning personality have endeared him to the Indian public, particularly the Hindu public, and though many may not agree with him or follow him in politics, they yield him respect and affection. Both by his age and his long public record, he is the Nestor of Indian politics, but a Nestor who seems a little out of date and very much out of touch with the modern world. His voice commands attention, but the language he speaks is no longer understood or heeded by many. It was natural, therefore, for Malveji not to join the Swaraj party, which was too advanced politically for him and required a disciplined adherence to the Congress policy. He wanted something more to the right and greater latitude, both politically and communally, and he got this in a new party, of which he was the founder and leader. It is not so easy to understand Lala Lajpat Rai's adherence to this new party, though his inclination was also somewhat to the right as well as towards a more communal orientation. I had met Lalaji in Geneva that summer, and from our talks I had not gathered that he contemplated taking up an aggressive attitude against the Congress party. How this happened I have still no idea. But in the course of the election campaign he made certain vague charges which showed how his mind had been working. He accused the Congress leaders of intriguing with people outside India. He further accused them of some such intrigue in establishing a Congress branch in Kabul. I do not think he ever specified his charges or went into any details in spite of repeated requests. I remember that when I read in the Indian papers that reached me in Switzerland about Lalaji's charges, I was astounded. As Congress Secretary, I knew all about our organization. I had myself been instrumental in getting the Kabul committee affiliated. Desbandu Das had taken the initiative in the matter. And though I did not then know, as I do not now know, the details of the charges, I could say from their general nature that they could have no foundation so far as the Congress was concerned. I do not know how Lalaji was misled in the matter. He may have relied on various rumors, and I think he must have been influenced by the talk he had recently had with Maulvi Obedullah, although there was nothing in that talk which seemed extraordinary to me. But elections are extraordinary phenomena. They have a curious way of upsetting tempers and ordinary standards. The more I see of them, the more I wonder, and a wholly undemocratic distaste of them grows within me. But personalities apart, the rise of the Nationalist Party, or some such party, was inevitable owing to the growing communal temper of the country. On the one side, there were the Muslim fears of a Hindu majority. On the other side, Hindu resentment at being bullied, as they conceived it, by the Muslims. Many a Hindu felt that there was too much of the stand up and deliver about the Muslim attitude, too much of an attempt to extort special privileges with the threat of going over to the other side. Because of this, the Hindu Mahasabha rose to some importance, representing as it did Hindu nationalism, Hindu communalism, opposing Muslim communalism. The aggressive activities of the Mahasabha acted on and stimulated still further this Muslim communalism, and so action and reaction went on, and in the process the communal temperature of the country went up. Essentially, this was a question between the majority group in the country and a big minority. But curiously enough, in some parts of the country the position was reversed. In the Punjab and Sindh, the Hindus as well as the Sikhs were in a minority, the Muslims in a majority, and these provincial minorities had a much fear of being crushed by a hostile majority in those provinces as the Muslims had in the whole of India. Or, to be more accurate, the middle-class job seekers in each group were afraid of being ousted by the other group, and to some extent the holders of vested interests were afraid of radical changes affecting those interests. The Swaraj party suffered because of this growth of communalism. Some of its Muslim members dropped off and joined the communal organizations, and some of its Hindu members drifted off to the Nationalist Party. Malviyaji and Lala Lajpat Rai made a powerful combination so far as the Hindu electorate was concerned, and Lalaji had great influence in the Punjab, the storm centre of communalism. On the side of the Swaraj Party or Congress, the chief burden of fighting the elections fell on my father. C.R. Das was no longer there to share it with him. He enjoyed a fight, or at any rate never shirked it, and the growing strength of the opposition made him throw all his great energy into the election campaign. He received and gave hard blows, little grace was shown or quarter given by either party. That election left a trail of bitter memories. The Nationalist Party met with a great measure of success, but this success definitely lowered the political tone of the Legislative Assembly. The centre of gravity moved more to the right. The Swaraj Party had itself been the right wing of the Congress. In its attempts to add to its strength, it had allowed many a doubtful person to creep in, and had suffered in quality because of this. The Nationalist Party followed the same policy, only on a lower plane, and a motley crew of title holders, big landholders, industrialists and others who had little to do with politics came into its ranks. The end of that year, 1926, was darkened by a great tragedy
which sent a thrill of horror all over India. It showed to what depths communal passion could reduce our people. Swami Shraddhananda was assassinated by a fanatic as he lay in bed.
What a death for a man who had bared his chest to the bayonets of the Gurkhas and marched to meet their fire. Nearly 8 years earlier, he, an Arya Samajist leader, had stood in the pulpit of the great Jama Masjid of Delhi and preached to a mighty gathering of Muslims and Hindus of unity and India's freedom. And that great multitude had greeted him with loud cries of
Hindu Musalman ki jai.
And outside in the streets they had jointly sealed that cry with their blood. And now he lay dead, killed by a fellow countryman who thought, no doubt, that he was doing a meritorious deed which would lead him to paradise. Always I have admired sheer physical courage, the courage to face physical suffering in a good cause, even unto death. Most of us, I suppose, admire it.
Swami Shraddhanand
had an amazing amount of that fearlessness. His tall and stately figure, wrapped in a sannyasi's robe, perfectly erect in spite or advanced years, eyes flashing, sometimes a shadow of irritation or anger at the weakness of others passing over his face. How I remember that vivid picture, and how often it has come back to me. End of chapter 22.